So let me start, Steve, as soon as we know we're on all three, and we are. So welcome, folks. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Christopher Mannion, and I'm here at the Population Research Institute to interview PRI President Steve Mosher. Now, Steve's scholarship ranges over 8 books and thousands of articles on China, international relations, testimony before Congress, and a host of related issues, many of which we're going to be discussing today. Our first focus today is PRI's new book, available in hard copy and also free as an ebook download on our website, pop.org. That's pop.org. It's called Pandemonium, and we're going to talk about that. It's a powerful analysis of what the virus has done to the world and what certain powerful groups in the world are up to using the virus as their excuse. That's right, as the Wuhan virus lingers on around the world, political leaders and other magnates in many countries have decided to take advantage of the confusion and uncertainty to strengthen their power and influence in various ways. So to investigate the approach that these governments and institutions are taking to consolidate their power and to change our culture, we're offering this free ebook right now that you can download while we're online here today. The firsthand accounts of these various experts from around the world are going to be fascinating and riveting when you get to them. Now, the book begins by looking at the origins of the virus, including, and we'll start with the incisive analysis by Steve Mosher. Steve, the world knows a lot about you, and here we are with the various forces around the world, the United Nations, the lawyers, the tech companies. This book contains a depth of worldwide analysis not found anywhere else. So Steve, you've joined us. I hope others are tuning in as we begin our discussion on Pandemonium. Steve, what's the story behind the title, Pandemonium?
Well, the China virus, and I insist on calling it the China virus, or perhaps the Chinese Communist Party virus would be more accurate because it comes from China. It was created as part of the Chinese Communist Party's bioweapons program. The China virus has literally unleashed pandemonium on the world. And it has been used, of course, by many, many different actors with many, many different agendas. There are national actors who have used the excuse of the China virus to lock down countries and peoples for months on end, confining them, basically putting them under house arrest. There are international actors who see the opportunity provided by the China virus to institute global governance. And of course, there are political movements like in the United States, Antifa and Black Lives Matter, which I believe have used the China virus and the unsettling experience of the American people over the last few months to advance their own leftist agendas. So this pandemonium is occurring at all levels of society in all countries around the world and indeed has globalist implications. I must say that I do not see, Chris, an overarching conspiracy. That is, this wasn't planned at the outset by some ghostly, smoke-filled back room of people launching an international intrigue. But it was seized upon by various national and international actors for their own purposes. We have David Rockefeller, and this is someone that we quote in the book Pandemonium, way back in 1994, saying, quote, "We are on the verge of a global transformation. All we need," he said, "is the right major crises, and the nations will accept the new world order." This was back in 1994, 26 years ago. The Rockefellers, of course, were the moneyed elite of the 70s, 80s, and 90s in the United States. They still have some influence, but they've been superseded, of course, by the Zuckerbergs of the world, the new high-tech billionaires and trillionaires who also see this crisis as an opportunity to advance, I think, an international agenda that is not necessarily in the interest of the American people. But reflect on those words. All we need is the right major crises, and the nations will accept the new world order. So there are lots of people, I think, on the international stage at the UN, various international organizations, who see this as an opportunity to advance international governance. And then moving to the national scene, every country in the world, virtually without exception, has been shaken to the core by the pandemic. And it has been used by leftist socialist movements everywhere, in Argentina, as we'll talk about, in Spain, in Germany, where Angela Merkel, of course, has confined her people to quarters for months on end, in Europe as a whole. The European Union has seen this as an opportunity to aggrandize itself. And here in the United States, of course, we find ourselves in the middle of a brutal political campaign where one party has sought to weaponize the pandemic against the sitting president. But let's go back, I think, to the beginning of the pandemic and talk a little bit about where it began, because I think we know pretty clearly where it began. It began.
Well, that's what's in the first chapter. And I might say that speaking of Argentina, the editor of this book is our colleague, the Argentinian Carlos Beltramo. And I met David Rockefeller. I was his guest 35 years ago in Argentina, and I will say only that once was enough. Now, in the first chapter, you point to evidence suggesting that the coronavirus, the China virus, originated in China, in a lab in Wuhan. And now the Communist Party of China has denied that. Where does that stand now?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party has said that it originated in a lab in the United States. In fact, they're very specific. They claim that it originated in the Fort Detrick labs run by the US Army, and that it was brought to China in October of 2019 during the military games, which were held in the city of Wuhan, where the famous Wuhan Institute of Virology is located. And those games were held from the 17th through the 24th of October, and that it was the US Army that brought this bioweapon to China and spread it throughout the population of Wuhan, from where it spread to the rest of China and the world. So that's the unbelievable cover story that the Chinese Communist Party has quietly told its 94 million members. And they in turn have quietly told the 1.4 billion people of China that it's all America's fault. Well, what does that tell you? This is the mirror image of the truth, Chris, the mirror image of the truth, because the truth is that it originated not in the United States, but in China. It originated in a virology lab, not in the United States, but in China. It was part of a bioweapons program, not in the United States, but in China, and was released not by the United States, but by China on its own people, and from there was deliberately released upon the world. So you can oftentimes simply take the propaganda from the left and reverse it, and you'll find yourself very close to the truth. That's certainly the case that we're dealing with now. So back to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has a very, very interesting history. It was built by the French. Yes, the French in 2017 completed construction on a P4 lab, which is the highest containment lab. The labs run, if you're doing research on dangerous pathogens, you have various levels of containment from P1 to P4. P1 is the lowest level containment, P2 is higher, P3, and then P4 is the highest level containment lab. You can't go in a P4 lab without protective equipment on, without a separate oxygen supply, and without being disinfected going in and coming back out again. There are always two attendance, 2 researchers on duty in a P4 lab at any given time in case there's an accident. This technology was not within reach of the Chinese Communist Party. And so they turned to the French to help them build a P4 lab. The French built it over our objections. We said this is dangerous technology. This is dual use technology. This is technology that could be used to create a bioweapon. So please, France, don't do it. The French, of course, did it anyway. And there was a ribbon cutting ceremony in February of 2017 when the lab was opened for the first time, fully complete and fully ready to do research. Now, the French assured us that there would be controls on the use of this P4 lab, that it could not be used for nefarious purposes because there would always be 50 French researchers on duty in the lab at any given time. There was, next to the Research Institute in Wuhan, there was a residence hall where, under the contract between the Chinese Communist Party and the French government, the French were to place 50 researchers in that residence hall to do research on an ongoing basis in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And thus, the French told us, you needn't worry about things going on in this lab that shouldn't be happening, because we will always be there. We will be watching over the shoulders of the Chinese researchers. Well, what happened in February of 2017 when the lab was actually opened for business? After the ribbon cutting ceremony, the French premier, the French delegation, and all the French researchers were shown the door. They were forced to leave. Not a single French researcher ever took up residence in the residence hall. Not a single French researcher was able to go into the P4 lab and actually observe the research that was being done by a very famous person in China, Dr. Shi. Her full Chinese name is Dr. Shi Zhengli. She's known in China as China's Batwoman because she has been collecting coronaviruses from bats for the past 15 years. She has collected over that period of time some 1,500 coronaviruses. Now, to put this in perspective, from the beginning of virology research over 100 years ago, the world has only isolated about 1,500 viruses all told. China, over the last decade and a half, has doubled the number of known viruses. Why is it out maniacally collecting coronaviruses from the wild? Well, because it's part of their bioweapons research program. They were hoping to find a dangerous coronavirus, something like SARS, but more infectious and more deadly, that they could potentially use as a bioweapon. We know they have a bioweapons program in place. We know that they signed the Bioweapons Convention in 1984, which prohibited such research. And we know that, like every other agreement they've ever signed with the international community or with the United States or with Great Britain over Hong Kong, they violated this agreement before the ink was dry on the paper. So this was what the P4 lab was intended to do. It was intended, under the direction of Dr. Shi Zhengli, to do bioweapons research. Now, she'd made a lot of strides in collecting dangerous pathogens, but also in improving them. Now, how do you improve a potentially dangerous pathogen? Well, the first thing you do, if you're Dr. Shi, working in the PLA, People's Liberation Army's bioweapons program, is you learn the latest techniques for manipulating genomes. And where do you learn those techniques? Well, you learn them from labs in the United States of America. And so she came, Dr. Shi Zhengli came years ago to the University of North Carolina lab, P4 lab, and learned how to do reverse genetics. That is, she learned how to take an existing virus and make it more deadly and make it more infectious by inserting pieces of other viruses into it. It's called reverse genetics 2. You can look it up on the internet. She also spent time at the Galveston National Laboratories run by the University of Texas the US labs run by the University of Texas in Galveston, Texas, where she perfected her skills. And then she took those skills that she had learned in the United States back to China. And in 2008, she began to publish research on how she was improving using gain of function research, improving dangerous pathogens to make them more infectious and more deadly. Now, let me just tell you that gain of function research is highly, highly controversial. And if you think about it, you can understand why. Because what you're doing is you're taking a coronavirus, for example, that may not be capable of infecting human beings very easily, and may, if it infects human beings, may not kill them. And you're helping it to gain functions. What kind of functions are you improving? What kind of functions are you helping it to gain? Well, you're helping it to become more infectious and more deadly. Those are the two functions that Dr. Shizhong Li was working on. In 2008, she began publishing journal articles again in 2010, 2015, 2017. There's a whole series of articles on her gain of function research published in the International Journal of Virology, Microbiology, and other very well-respected international journals, showing her entire trajectory, showing that she had mastered these gain of function techniques, and she was using them to create coronaviruses that could infect. In one paper, she says that she used it to infect human lung tissue. So does that sound anything like the China virus that we're now all dealing with? A coronavirus that can infect human lung tissue and cause pneumonia? Well, of course it does, because that's exactly the kind of research she was doing. Now, I said this research was highly controversial. It was opposed by many people in the US government, inside and outside of our National Institutes of Health. But the big proponent of gain of function research from the beginning, when it first became technically feasible to do this research, was none other than the now famous Dr. Anthony Fauci, who back in 2011 wrote an article in the Washington Post arguing that we needed to pursue gain of function research. And his argument went as follows. He said, we need to use gain of function research to create deadly pathogens in the laboratory so that we can find out what therapeutic procedures can be used to treat them when people fall ill from them, and what vaccines can be developed to vaccinate people against getting the disease at all. So basically his argument was, we're going to create deadly pathogens in the lab so we can find out therapies and vaccines to control them and prevent them from becoming pandemics if they ever cross the species barrier and become prevalent in the human population. So that was the argument. Well, that's all fun and games until you create a deadly pathogen in the lab and then you release it either deliberately or before you have a therapy or before you have a vaccine to control it. Now, that's exactly what Dr. Shizhong Li was doing. She was creating a deadly pathogen in the laboratory.
Well, Steve, if I may, our editor, Carlos Beltramo, said that this book offers an alternative view, and what you're saying is quite persuasive and must be known to everyone in the professional community. And yet we have United Nations contributor Maria Orquídea Caballero Moreno, an international lawyer, says the United Nations is strangely silent about this. Spain's Javier Villamor writes that China is not the only source of disinformation, but it seems that there's an awful lot of disinformation to block the very fundamental facts that you're trying to relate to us. Who's standing in the way of the truths that you are telling us?
Well, there are a lot of vested interests at play here. Now, I should say, that we could talk at length about exactly how the genetic engineering was carried out. The China virus has 29,000 nucleotides, and there were insertions at a couple places. We don't need to go into that kind of detail, I think. But we could also talk about the number of specialists around the world who concur that this was genetically engineered in the lab. We have geneticists from Australia, from Norway, from Great Britain, from Italy. Professor Trito from Italy has written an entire book on the subject of how this China virus was genetically engineered in the lab. But as you suggest, there are powerful forces arrayed against the truth of the matter. And where do these forces come from? And why are they so vociferous in denying the obvious truth that this was created in the laboratory? This did not jump from a bat to a human. This did not result this did not come from a bat flying from a bat cave 1,000 miles away from Wuhan to the Wuhan seafood market and landing there in someone's soup and infecting them. This did not come from a little scaly anteater called a pangolin. There is no natural equivalent to the China virus. This is, as probably the most famous whistleblower in this entire scenario speaks about, Dr. Yan Li Meng, Dr. Yan, who is from China and who knows in intimate detail how the genetic engineering was done. She says finding this China virus is like finding an elephant with monkey ears, or a rabbit with an elephant's trunk. It's very unusual. It has no natural counterpart. It was engineered in the lab. It came out of nowhere. So it did not come from nature. So why are there so many people saying no to the most obvious explanation for the origin of the China virus? Well, let's start with our own Dr. Fauci, who was funding the laboratory at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Now, he wasn't funding it directly. He was funding it through an environmental group which received over $7 million to fund the collection of viruses from the wild around the world. And that environmental group in turn funded Batwoman Dr. Shizhong Li's effort to collect coronaviruses from bats and other animals in the wild. So why do you think Dr. Anthony Fauci would be loath to consider the possibility that this was a laboratory creation? I don't know, perhaps because he was funding the laboratory. Now, what about the rest of the US virology establishment, which is grudgingly, I think, now beginning to admit that, yes, it could possibly have been engineered in the lab? Why have they been so slow to speak this obvious truth? Well, let's go back again to Dr. Fauci, whose annual budget is over $8 billion. That's 8 billion with a B, $8,000 million. That's the budget of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease, which he has controlled for almost the last 4 decades. Dr. Fauci has a lot of money and grants to give out to virologists in the United States and around the world. I think that tells you something.
Well, you mentioned, Steve, you've got all of these PhDs, and you've got these experts who are easily capable of doing the fundamental analysis you describe, or at least understanding it. But one of our authors, Dr. Miklos Lukas de Perine, writes that big tech, where all these PhD engineers are congregated, is playing China's game right in the middle of it. How does that come to pass, and why?
Well, I mentioned Dr. Yan Li Meng, who escaped from China on April 17th with the Chinese Ministry of State Security hot on her heels. I believe that if they were able to find out where she was hiding in the United States, they would immediately ship her back to China, and she would probably receive a death sentence. She was threatened with that before she left Hong Kong many months ago. I've interviewed Dr. Yan at length, and Dr. Yan says this. She says that the backbone for the China virus, that is the original genome that was used as a backbone to do the two insertions I talked about, came from the People's Liberation Army. That it is the only People's Liberation Army virus isolated from the wild. So the China virus came from the People's Liberation Army labs. She said, using this backbone from the People's Liberation Army, you can make the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is what we're calling the China virus, very easily, she said, with a reasonably equipped lab and the techniques, you can do it in 6 months. Now, so she's been on Fox News. She's been, I've written articles about her. She has now, however, been banned from Facebook, and she had her Twitter account taken down. Why would the foremost and what China's foremost expert on genomic engineering, Dr. Yan Li Meng, who came at great risk to the United States, at risk of her life, and has in fact put her family in jeopardy as well, why would she be banned from Facebook and banned from Twitter for speaking the truth about the origin of the virus? Here, I think, Chris, we get into American politics. Not so much the virology establishment in the United States anymore, which is eager to deny the fact that genetic engineering techniques that they developed, that they perfected, were taken to China and used to develop a dangerous virus that has now infected the world and caused a pandemic. That's embarrassing enough. But now let's think about the political aspects of this. I think you would agree that back in January, with the American economy firing on all cylinders, with economic growth reaching levels that the proponents of America's decline thought we'd never reach again, with growth over 3% approaching 4% per annum, with wages going up for the middle class and for the working class, with poverty rates going down, with factories moving back from China and new jobs in industry being created at an incredible rate. With all that happening in January, it was very clear, I think, to everybody that President Trump would be reelected for a second term. And then the China virus was unleashed on the world deliberately by the Chinese Communist Party. And that whole scenario was turned upside down. And I think America's enemies overseas, chiefly the Chinese Communist Party, but there are others, Iran, for example, North Korea, and also Trump's enemies at home saw this as an opportunity to turn the tables on him. They tried to change the name of the China virus to the Trump virus and blame everything on the president. I think that's one reason why our high-tech masters of the universe at these trillion-dollar companies that control what we can see and what we can say on the internet decided to intervene in the story of the China virus in a big way, and to really try to dampen down, they call it shadow banning, really try to dampen down the voices of truth who were speaking out about the origin of the virus in a Chinese lab, about the spread of the virus by the Chinese Communist Party throughout the world, and how people on this side of the Pacific were trying to use the virus to achieve their desired outcome in the November elections. And I think, quite frankly, that big tech has been making an in-kind contribution to one particular campaign to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars by preventing the truth about the virus from coming out. And I must say, this has not been a cost-free exercise. Human lives have been lost because of the misinformation that has been spread by big tech and the truthful information that has been suppressed by big tech, both here in this country and around the world, because these people have global enterprises. People in India and people in Germany, people all around the world use these high-tech communication devices to talk to their friends and neighbors.
Well, we've got a new item of interest. Well, first of all, our own website and has been attacked for the last week now with relentless bombardiering. The techs have a word for it that essentially means that the Chinese can send us 700,000 or 800,000 requests an hour to view a document, which just essentially blocks us altogether. Two of our colleagues, The Wanderer and LifeSite News, are down, one for days and one for several hours. But one of those items that has been, shall we say, shadow banned big time is Joe Biden. Joe Biden is back in his basement until tomorrow. He has been there since last Saturday. He has a lot to say about foreign policy. You once wrote that he was Obama's point man on several foreign policy issues. Yet tomorrow, we just learned today that the so-called debate commission has removed foreign policy from the items to be addressed in the debate. And just in case President Trump should raise the issue, they have apparently installed a mute button to make sure that the American people aren't going to hear what he has to say. What do you make of that?
Well, again, this is the China virus is or should be a big issue in American domestic politics. But there are people on the left who do not want to mention the word China right now in any context, whether it be in the context of the theft of intellectual property, the currency manipulation, the constant cyber attacks, which you just mentioned, the forced transfer of technology, the militarization of the South China Sea, the military buildup of China in general, the constant threats made by China against the United States and our allies in the Pacific, the use of fentanyl to kill, which is actually manufactured in China and shipped to the United States to kill about 50,000 Americans each year. And now the China virus that's been unleashed upon the world. And the reason they don't want to talk about China is because Vice President Joe Biden was the point man, those are his words, not mine, the point man on China during the Biden-Obama administration. And so when we talk about China, when we talk about the China threat, it reminds people that Joe Biden was in charge of dealing with the China threat for 8 years, from 2009 to early 2017, during which time it grew larger rather than smaller, during which time the pivot to Asia did not materialize, during which time the islands in the South China Sea were militarized, despite the fact that the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, said that they would not be militarized. And so there is a narrative out there which is developed by global elites and by the left in the United States, which is doing everything possible to avoid talking about China, because they do not want to remind people that the reason why China is now the principal geostrategic threat to the United States, why China has grown over the last 20 years as large and powerful as it is, so that it constitutes a threat to American geopolitical dominance around the world, is precisely because the Biden-Obama administration was asleep at the switch for the better part of a decade. So controlling the narrative, controlling the story is very, very important. And if you control the high ground of high tech, it's very, very easy to do that.
Well, with the developments of recent days to continue lockdowns in several states in the United States, where the Archbishop of San Francisco has to march in a procession, which is barely permitted unless it's called a demonstration for the right causes, in order to allow people back into church to hear Mass, which has been now forbidden for 6 months and more. Juan Angel Soto raises a possibility that governments like that of California, like that of Virginia, like that of New York, and other Democrat states especially, are using the virus to establish and expand their emergency powers. That certainly makes sense that leftists who run the blue states in the United States would want to do that. But right now, there doesn't seem to be any pushback. What do you make of that?
Well, we have in the United States a federal system of government. So the president of the United States cannot, short of declaring martial law or invoking the Insurrection Act, cannot overrule the governors of the states in these matters. And one sees a sharp divide between the reaction of Republican governors to the pandemic and the reaction of Democrat governors to the pandemic. I think it's safe to say that the Democrat governors have, in general, overreacted. We see that in Governor Murphy in New Jersey. We see that in the actions of Governor Andrew Cuomo in New York, certainly of the actions of my one-time home state, California, where Governor Newsom has locked down a state that has far lower case rates and far lower mortality rates than New Jersey or New York. It almost seems as if these people who believe in enhancing their political power have let their sort of their inner fascist demons out and sort of almost revel in the opportunity to control people's activities in the name of public health. And I will say this, since we're on this topic, now that the pandemic has worked out so well in quotes, for the left, not just in the United States, but in other countries around the world, I do not think we will see the last of pandemics. I think there will be other pandemics on the horizon. Maybe we should not call them pandemics the second time around. We should probably call them plandemics, because they will be planned exercises in using public health to seize government control. Now, I hope that we're prepared, better prepared for the next pandemic than we were for the last one. But again, back to the divide between the Republicans and Democrats. We have Governor DeSantis in Florida and the governor of Texas leaving decisions largely on whether or not to shut down aspects of the local economy to mayors and to counties, rather than imposing a one-size-fits-all solution on dealing with the pandemic. If you have a hotspot, maybe you want to close down the movie theaters for a time. If you don't, there's no reason for the governor of your state to impose that on you because of a hotspot somewhere else in the state. So I think we see the Jeffersonian ideal of that government is best that governs least, sort of exemplified in the red states, and we see the opposite ideal exemplified in the blue states, where the lockdowns came early, and the lockdowns are still in place, despite the fact that the evidence seems to be that locking down people inside their homes does not stop the spread of the virus. In fact, in some cases, it seems to have encouraged the spread of the virus. We now have in Great Britain a second lockdown. And the second lockdown is even more onerous than the first, because the government has told people that not only are they to stay locked down inside their house, they are to socially distance themselves from their own family members, so that the husband is to live in one room, the wife is to live in another, the adolescent child, the teenager is to live in a third room, and they're to go to the bathroom separately when no one else is there. They go to the kitchen and eat separately when no one else is there. Now, that is an extreme manifestation, almost putting people in isolation and solitary confinement, which has other, of course, deleterious consequences over time on people's health.
Well, that sounds like Pandemonium's subtitle could be Paranoia.
Pandemonium and paranoia, paranoia fed by this media narrative, what some people call, pandemic porn, which is all over exaggerating the number of cases, misattributing deaths to the China virus, which actually come from other causes. I'm not minimizing the seriousness of the disease when we're talking about people over the age of 70 or people with comorbidities, with pre-existing conditions. But the evidence shows that very young people, school children and college-age children, are at very little risk from the China virus, which has been engineered to disproportionately attack the elderly. So it's the elderly that we need to protect. And as for the rest, we should be allowed to go about our business.
Well, that's one of our friends from Argentina, an author in the book, Eric Kamarath. He talks about the challenge to mediating institutions, a term that has appeared for the past 40 years in social analysis about fraternal organizations, volunteer groups, religious communities, and as you just described, the family itself. Now, in the last 15 or 20 years, the Knights of Columbus and fraternal organizations like the Moose, the Elks, they've been shrinking because people have not had a greater sense of community that used to prevail. And this virus has just laid these institutions low. Everybody has been chased back into his own house. And speaking of mediating institutions, the most important one over the course of history in Western civilization is the church. And churches have had to sue to be able to gather. They have sued in order to be able to exercise their rights as a community guaranteed by the First Amendment, the rights of association. This is a big deal because some of these wounds, some of this damage is going to be very hard to redress. These organizations like the Knights of Columbus, which my father was at the ground floor on during World War I at Catholic U and then the Army, took decades to build and broaden and strengthen. They can be knocked low with a series of the pandemics that you described until everybody is locked up in his own room in his own house, and who knows who's going to be producing the goods that keep people alive and well. But this current is all flowing the wrong way. How can communities and groups like these that I've mentioned respond and at the same time not get arrested for illegally convening meetings, convening masses, convening conventions, trade shows, and all the rest? How can this be done?
Well, I think the first thing that Americans have to do is elect political leaders who believe in freedom and who believe in the First Amendment of the Constitution, religious freedom and freedom of speech, assembly, association, and all the rest that goes along with it. Those freedoms tend to be, abridged by people on the left side of the political spectrum. So everyone needs to go out and vote. But I would say about the Knights of Columbus, I had dinner last week in Connecticut with the CEO of the Knights of Columbus, Patrick Riley, who tells me that because of the China virus, the Knights are now allowing people to register online to join the Knights. And I believe that the registration fee has been waived. So they're trying to accommodate themselves to the new situation where it's hard for chapters to meet and gather together. So one of the workarounds, of course, to the new strictures that have been placed upon our activities is to do exactly what you and I are doing now. We're meeting over the internet and we're inviting other people to join us. So we have to continue to do that. But make no mistake, the dream of the left is to extinguish all the mediating institutions of society. You see that dream in full bloom, actually full nightmare, full pandemonium style in China, where the Chinese Communist Party believes it is should be the only licit organization in the entire country, and that everything in China should revolve around it. And as for the rest, other mediating institutions should either be subservient to the Chinese Communist Party, like the Patriotic Church in China, which reports to the Chinese Communist Party, or they should not exist at all, because the Chinese Communist Party wants to be all things to all people. It wants to keep the Chinese people isolated in individual cells of fear, listening only to their masters in the party and learning from them how they're to think and where they're to go and how they're to behave. Now, does that sound familiar to those of us who've been locked up in our homes for months on end? Absolutely. It's the dream of leftists everywhere to abolish the mediating institutions that stand in the way of their power. The mediating institution of the church, for example, which meets people in spiritual distress and gives them comfort and the peace that passes all understanding. And if people had been allowed to go to church over the last few months instead of being forced to stay outside the churches, which were locked up, suicide rates would be lower. Suicide attempts would be far lower. There would be solace available, spiritual solace available from the places where people have traditionally gone for such spiritual advice and comfort, and that is the churches. But the churches have been locked. Deaths from fentanyl, suicide attempts from overdoses would be lower because the churches would be open. People would be free to go and talk to their pastors or priests. So these are some of the costs of the leftist agenda, which seeks to destroy not just the church and other institutions like the Knights, but also the family itself, which of course it wants to define out of existence the family. I mean, if you can define the family as a man and his dog, then effectively you've defined the family out of existence. So again, all of these things stand in the way of the leftist desire for power, and they're seen by the left as enemy organizations which must be defeated. And the China virus has produced an awfully handy club with which to beat these mediating institutions into silence and subservience.
Well, the book is a fascinating collection. We have testimonies from countries like Germany, Mexico, England, Argentina, where each government in its own way is at least tempted, if not absolutely full force, attempting to get all the power it can in as many different ways as possible. And it's a fascinating read to see how that's being done in various countries with their own cultures. Mexico, for instance, is fascinating because they've got an election coming up, whereas Germany is supposedly the most got it all together country in the world, and yet they are fighting a hard-fought battle against the family and keeping folks under control. And I see we're moving towards the end of this first of three discussions we're going to have about our book, Pandemonium. And in case you tuned in late, folks, we're talking with Steve Mosher today about the Population Research Institute's new book, available in hard copy and also free as an ebook, a download on our website, pop.org, pop.org. The book is called Pandemonium, It's a powerful analysis of what the virus has done and is doing, and what certain powerful groups in the world are up to using the virus as their excuse. You can download that book free as soon as we ring off here at the Population Research Institute's website at pop.org. We are going to be back next Monday and Wednesday with a continued conversation about some of the angles of this book, which we haven't been able to touch, as well as, and perhaps we can have a parting shot here, Steve. Speaking of China, tomorrow is the memorial of St. John Paul II, and apparently Cardinal Parolin has chosen tomorrow to make the official announcement that the Vatican's agreement with Communist China is going to be renewed for another 2 years.
Yes, I saw today that he had indicated that the agreement was going to be renewed. I and others, like the great Cardinal Joseph Zen of Hong Kong, have advised against renewing the agreement because we don't see that it has produced good fruit. We see, in fact, that it has been used by the Chinese Communist Party as a tool of suppression, not just of the underground church, which is being told basically that Rome has ordered it to report to the authorities, to register with the Chinese Communist Party's Religious Affairs Office, and to join the ranks of the Communist Party-controlled Patriotic Church. But that it has been used to also in a campaign of suppression against the patriotic church itself, because in China today, we have a new high-tech cultural revolution underway in which, again, the Chinese Communist Party has determined that it is going to be all things to all people, and that anyone who believes in something other than the Chinese Communist Party cannot be a good citizen of the People's Republic of China and is de facto disloyal. And so it is not just Catholics, it is Protestants, home church believers, Taoists, Buddhists, Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, you name it, are all under the gun, are all being persecuted because, again, their allegiance, according to the Chinese Communist Party, should be solely directed at the party itself. Now, Cardinal Parolin knows this campaign is underway, because when I met with him a little over 2 years ago, I told him that the Chinese Communist Party was trying to once again stamp out all religious belief in China, the way it tried to in the 1960s during the first Cultural Revolution. Of course, the party won't succeed. The church, the Catholic Church, has always thrived under persecution. And this episode of persecution in China will be no exception to that rule. But it is a sad thing that the church is seen now, the Vatican as seen in China by members of the underground church as not supporting them during this time of persecution. I wish the terms of the Sino-Vatican agreement should be made public. They haven't been, it's still secret, because at least that would take away from the Chinese Communist Party the ability to use this secret agreement to tell the Chinese people that they must obey the party line because the Vatican has told them so. The secret agreement allows the Chinese Communist Party to use the barred authority of the Vatican to help stamp out Catholic faith in China, which is a horrible and horrific irony.
Well, to wind it up this week, we're going to be talking next Monday and Wednesday at 3 o'clock Eastern Time here at the Population Research Institute about more facets of the China virus, its impact on the world, which our book has called Pandemonium. It's a free book, ebook from our website at pop.org. And next week, you'll be able to submit your questions, send them to us ahead of time at the Population Research Institute right on our website, contact us, and we will be discussing more about these issues with Steve Mosher, China scholar and the president of the Population Research Institute when we come back next Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until then, I'm Chris Mannion from the PRI offices in Virginia. Thank you for tuning in. Steve, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Chris.